That's us. That's live.
Okay.
Wow, what was
I
that?
think that was a text message coming through.
Just in time.
Yeah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Amrita. This is Amrita by the Book. You're on my channel, and joining me today are two of my oldest friends on BookTube, two ladies that I love deeply and who have excellent reading taste. Do you want to introduce yourself? Rosie, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Rosie. I make BookTube videos at Rosie Cockshutt. And if you want to find me anywhere else on the internet, that's also where I am. It's very basic and not at all bookish, but at least it's consistent. And I always struggle to introduce myself on these things because I'd like to think that I read a lot of different things and get interested in a lot of different kinds of books and a lot of different topics. So if generally a mix of nonfiction and fiction and all sorts of different things sounds like something you're interested in, yeah, come on over, hang out, and I hope you like my videos. Katie, you take over because this is getting weird.
Okay. I'm Katie from the channel Katie Reads and Rants. I'm less organized than Rosie, so if you want to find me other places, you just have to go to links in my description boxes because most of my stuff is still just my personal things and not at all book related. But anyway, like Rosie, I have a hard time introducing my channel because I tend to just go where my interests take me with reading, and that is all over the place. Like currently I'm reading a philosophy book and a horror book and a book on Pan Am, so it's kind of just all over the place. But if you like, eclectic reading, that's what I do.
I think that's basically why I began following the two of you, is because like you both read so widely, and I really enjoyed that, and just like having just a wide selection of things to just add to my TBR, because everyone knows like I need more things to add to my TBR. Like, it's a disease, but
don't we all?
Okay, so today we're here to talk about this book by Kristen Ghodsee, who is an American academic. And this book is really about the United States, but also about socialism in general. And it's a bunch of different things that we're going to be talking about. But it's called Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism. So obviously, the first time I heard about this book, it went immediately on my TBR. And Rosie, I believe you have a little introduction to the book.
Well, if by introduction you mean I'm going to roughly tell you what I was reading on the blurb 5 minutes ago, then yes.
Yes. That was.
Basically, as Amrita said, Ghodsee is an academic. She did her PhD in looking at the transition of women's experiences as the Eastern Bloc countries transitioned out of communism and into capitalism, and how that changed women's lives, and what were the impacts? Was it good? Was it bad? What was different, basically? And then has gone on, I think she's a university professor somewhere now, to do research in this area, to teach in this area, and look really at how capitalism has a disproportionately negative effect on women as compared to men through various things, such as reproductive things, where for now people with uteruses have to bear children, and that's something that doesn't affect people without uteruses, but throughout all sorts of things, whether it's ways historic misogyny is still shaping our labor market now, or ways current misogyny is shaping our world. She looks at some of the ways various policies implemented under socialism or communism can alleviate some of that impact on women, which this sounds very vague. It is, because I think there's a lot of this stuff where you really have to get into the details a bit to get more specific. Obviously, this is why I
mean, we'll talk about it, because there's like a ton of things that we want to get through. And also, like, I do want to mention that this is like a primer. So this isn't, like this is just giving like an overview of a great many issues that she's discussing within the book. So, and I'll come to that at the end. Like, I do want to touch upon like the generality of it. And how it kind of misses the intersectionality and why that is and all that kind of stuff. But before we begin, I thought that it would make sense to just go round robin and talk about our first impressions about it. Katie, what did you think about this book? Like, what kind of impression did it make on you?
A lot of things in my life actually started making more sense. Because this is very American centered, let's face it. And I live in America and I've been married twice. So I have a lot of the things that they were talking about completely explained why my first marriage did not work. And I was like, oh, that's exactly the dynamic that was happening. And now that first husband was a major proponent of capitalism, free market, free everything, anti-government. And my second marriage is going much better because, like me, he's much more liberal. He's much more let's share the load, etc. And just comparing and contrasting the two different dynamics based on what I was reading in this book was like kind of therapeutic, actually.
All right. What about you, Rosie?
I think I had a much more... It explained and made sense in the context of the world around me reaction to it. It was fascinating. It was interesting. There was, I think, a lot of things that were explained where you go, oh yeah, that kind of is how our world works. And that is why that issue affects people this way, and made a lot of links. But I don't know. I've been lucky in that both my parents' marriage and my current partner and I, who's my only serious long-term live-together relationship, in a lot of ways, I see the stuff they described in, say, socialist countries or Scandinavian countries a lot more in my personal experience than the typical American experience that they're describing. So I guess it was a little less personally impactful, but also really, I think, puts in context a lot of our general society.
See, this is why I thought this would be a good conversation between the three of us, because from things you've said before, Rosie, I know that we have very different backgrounds, upbringings, relationship dynamics, and then Amrita is like very well traveled. So she's seen a lot of different dynamics in different places. And so I was like, man, this is going to be good.
No, it's right, because when you were talking about how this is so personal, I was actually thinking about that a lot while I was reading this book, because there were so many aspects of this that are obviously uniquely American, right? Like, and she's very upfront about that. She's like, right. Yes, this is an American book about American politics and American women, but it's also like really interesting to see how the same dynamics work out around the world. In like multiple cultures that I've lived in, and I was just, I'll talk about it at length, but I would say that within the first chapter of this book, I just felt radicalized. I was like, all right, where do I go, and like who do I have to like murder with a Molotov cocktail? Sign me up. It was pretty great. Let's talk about some of the things that really stood out for us, because and I'll start, because I know like some of the stuff can be like too personal or whatever, so feel free to jump in or whatever. The one thing that really struck me about that, there's a portion in the book where she is talking about this really controversial paper that came out a little while ago, and I remember that paper coming out and it being like a real talking point, even outside of academic circles, where it basically said that women use sex as a resource and they can trade it for a better life, basically. And And in the book, like she's talking about like these different examples, so her work is really focused on the Eastern Bloc. So she's talking about Eastern Europe and Russia, or the former Soviet Union, basically. So she talks about like how when capitalism became a thing in Russia, for example, one of the first things that happened was the creation of these gold digger academies, is how she described it. I want to know so much more about it. Like I just finished the book yesterday, so I really want to spend some time doing like deep research. I want to know what goes on in like gold
I want
digging.
a documentary, like that
Yeah.
Vice documentary you shared a while ago about showgirls in Pakistan.
Yeah,
I want something like that about this. That would be so interesting.
It was like it just kickstarted so many memories and like old arguments that I had with various different people, male and female, throughout the years. But I remembered most vividly. So I lived in Thailand for a long time. I lived in Bangkok, and in Bangkok, of course, like one of the first things that comes to mind when you're talking about Bangkok is the sex trade, right? Because anytime there's like any kind of talk about like sex trafficking or sex trade or transgenderism and like all that kind of stuff in Asia, Thailand is like one of the first names that comes to mind. And there's of course a historical reason for that. It's the Vietnam War and the fact that Bangkok was a comfort station for the American soldiers. And then before that, during the Second World War, it was a comfort station for the Japanese soldiers. So there's like a long history, like a complicated, painful history there that nobody really talks about when they're talking about like Bangkok being like the center of the sex trade or whatever. But today, like in the 21st century, what that has evolved into is like a lot of older white men who settle down in Thailand, retire to Thailand because, it's a cheaper economy and they can live off their pension much better in Thailand than they can back in the West. And they marry local women. And these women are like way younger than they are. And they're usually from, poorer families. And, they'll have like a second family with these young women, or else they'll just be like living with these women and they'll have like an unofficial marriage, as like a bunch of really gross men would tell me. Like it's not legal, which basically means like they can't get a visa to go back to the UK or the US with them, basically. So if things go bad, they can just abandon them and like leave. But I remember like being really disturbed by this because, these were like really old men and really young women. And I remember that dynamic. And I was talking about it to like this Kiwi friend of mine who just has this ability to just cut real, like clear to the bone of the matter. And she said, well, why wouldn't those women marry these men? Because if they married a Thai man of their own class, then they would be expected to cook and clean and have kids and take care of the kids and, work. And they're doing the exact same service, except they're getting paid better by these men who are older and will presumably die sooner and won't be like, it's not like as long of a commitment. And in the short term, it just works out for them. And I remember thinking, like sitting there as we were like drinking or something, and she told this to me, and I was just like, wow. My brain was just like, I really have no argument against it, because I had thought about it as an exploitation. But she told me, like, they're not victims. So you can't always look at the experiences of women through like a single lens. So yeah, I was just wondering, like, was there something similar that occurred to you? Like, was there a point in the book that just immediately kicked something in your brain?
I found that section about the sex economics, or whatever that paper was called, also really fascinating. I'm slightly younger and wasn't aware of that sort of thing when it came out, so I'd actually not been exposed to it. But for those of you who don't know, I'm an economist. That's what I studied, and I work as an economist. So from that point of view, it was like reading that chapter was like, yes, this absolutely makes sense. Not in a necessarily this is right, or this is the way the world should work, or this is the way people should have to behave, but just like, yeah, that's a very good way of describing what's going on and putting into words things that I think sort of everyone accepts is/was happening, but we never talk about. Right? Like, why do other women care if you're, you know, easy? Why do other women? Oh, because of how it affects them. Not just because of what they think of you. Like, that judgment is tied to something bigger. And yeah, that chapter was really impactful that way.
Yeah, I found that absolutely fascinating. That was one of the areas where I was sitting there and I was like, this makes so much sense. So much sense. Because especially in terms of marriage, like I was very, very young when I got married the first time. And I didn't have a job because I was 17. And it's really hard to get a job when you're 17, especially when you don't have your parents there to like help you with things. And so it was an expectation that he was going to make the money and pay the bills, and I was going to be available for whatever he wanted, which is not cool, and quickly like took the magic out of everything. Like, sex wasn't romantic anymore. It wasn't something that I even enjoyed doing because now it was an expectation. It was very transactional. And I knew it wasn't about me. It was never about me. And it was just, there was a section where she told a story about her friend who had left her job to get married and have this man's kids, and he wanted her to stay home. And she, when the author paid for dinner, she put the $20 or whatever away and was like, oh, I'll pay you back after I fuck him later because he'll be in a better mood. And that's like totally how that works. Like if I wanted to go out to a nice dinner or something, like that's what I would do, because then it was like, okay, I did my job, now you owe me.
Right.
And I don't know. It
Like
was just,
that dynamic was like so familiar to me. Like, you know, it was like really like she was talking about a very specific American experience, but I was like, I'm Indian. I know that dynamic, you know, like that is how I've seen, like, you don't even have to be like, I'm not going to speak for the United States, but in India, like, you don't even have to be married. You just absorb that dynamic by almost by osmosis, by just being around these couples where the man makes all the financial decisions and you can see the woman is like on a leash basically. So yeah, that was
I think that's becoming more common in the United States to not be married but still have that dynamic, but it's very much, I think, more of a marriage thing because it's official, it's permanent, you know, whereas there's something about not being married that lacks a sense of permanence in the United States, at least in my realm of experience. So
I also just want to mention, like, since we're talking about this chapter, there's also this thing about, so this is a chapter where we get the title of this book, right? Because the title of this book is, it's a pretty clickbaity title.
It really is.
If she had actually said, well, this is a book about like, why is socialism good for you? Like, I don't think it would have sold as well, obviously. But this chapter is really fun because it also talks about like where she gets the title from is the study that they did in the Eastern European countries where they just wanted to prove that their system worked better for everybody. And so they ran like, I don't know, some sort of like happiness study where they were talking to women and they were asking them like, do you feel like fulfilled and happy in your marriages? And they were like, yes, like we have great sex, we're like really happy. And they were like, then the West got like really mad, Western Europe got really mad, and they had what she termed the Great Orgasm War.
And you can totally see a bunch of, I think this is in West Germany, West German, probably male scientists being like, what are you talking about? Of course our wives enjoy it. Of course they do.
No, we're just really good at pretending.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like so a lot of this book is really about because she's really talking about the Cold War, basically. That's what, her dynamics, like the origins of her ideas about the world, and the genesis of this book are really lie in the Cold War, which is what she grew up with. Like she talks about how she quit college and she just went off she bought a one-way ticket to Europe, and she thought that she might just die in a missile strike or something while the Cold War was going on. And then like 2 months later, the wall came down and the world just changed forever. But that really made me think about like how I feel like, Katie, you too, but like I know Rosie for sure were born after the wall came down, and I was born before the wall came down, but I'm from India, so there's a whole other thing. But the two of you are from North America, and so Rosie's Canadian, Katie's American, I'm Indian, just in case nobody knows. Like we're coming from like 3 different places. So coming from that state, what she talks about how the generation that was born after 89 has never really known anything other than capitalism and have grown up in the shadow of capitalism triumphant. Did that like make sense to you? Like, did you connect to that at all?
I think it did, but to be clear, I only finished reading this book 13 hours ago, and I've spent a fair bit of that sleeping, so I haven't done a huge amount of thinking, but I think that's something that I'd sort of always taken for granted, and I'd never thought about what it would be like to live in a different sort of world, because I was born in 94, and it was really only in my late teens when I was taking history in high school in like grade 12 or something that I was realizing how recent the Cold War was to like my experience of the world. I guess before that, it always seemed like, oh, that's like the 40s and the 50s and like that's ages ago. And I was like, wait, no, that was only 5 years before I was born. This actually isn't that far off. And now I think that's something I want to sit with a bit and think about, like, well, yeah, what does it mean that I've only ever lived in a world where capitalism is basically unchallenged by a major power, challengers, but there's no major competition. And that was a very interesting element that I'm not sure where I fall with it yet.
Yeah, I was born in 92, so also after. And yeah, I guess kind of, but it's a little bit different for me because TV was very monitored, and so mostly what we watched was like the old TV shows that my mom grew up with. So I got kind of a different sense of what life was like, in the 70s, basically, because that's most of the TV that I was watching. So I always kind of had a sense of it had been different. And then I've been like, this is a weird thing, but as a child, all I read was historical fiction. Like, I think I've started reading historical fiction out of the adult section when I was like 10. So a lot of it was because of the TV shows I was watching. I would seek out books that had similar premises. So I always had an idea that life had changed drastically, but also in America, like, it's very much a bubble. Like, we're very self-centered. We think we're the center of the universe. And so that's something that I, even knowing these things, it was through that lens of America's obviously the best. It wasn't until I got older and started critically thinking about things and, well, discovered the internet, really, that it gave me a different perspective on what it must have been like to not live in the United States at that time. Like, sure, there was fear of, missile strikes and stuff here, but imagine what it would be like to be going through that upheaval, you know? So while, yeah, I guess I've always lived in a world where capitalism is unchallenged, I have a sense of a world in which it wasn't, or it was. What am I trying to say here? Does that make sense?
Yes,
it
it does
makes
make
total sense.
Yeah. I think like what really struck me about that is that so yes, American exceptionalism is a thing, right? Like I might have grown up on the other side of the world, but um, from the time that I was a child, I've always seen America ascendant, and India went through its liberalization period in the early 90s, and like 1992 is when we opened up our economy. And as soon as we did, America just moved in. And the first thing that America does when, it influences a country is like through its pop culture. So the first thing that came in was MTV. And then it was like Coca-Cola and like all that kind of stuff, like it was very much like a cultural reset. And so I grew up in a world where America was ascendant, and the 90s were very good for American culture. I feel like it really is just communism had fallen, like the world has changed, and there was like a real sense of like we did it, like the world is going to be amazing from now on, and then things just didn't work out, I guess. But I was thinking about it, because a large section of this book is about childcare. Because as Rosie said in the beginning of this broadcast, it's like this, like the version of feminism that I grew up on, that I came of age understanding, was a version that said men and women are equal and therefore they have no differences. Anything a man can do, a woman can do, etc. Which, okay, fine. But there is a difference in that our bodies do different things. And one of the things that our bodies do differently is that women's bodies bear children. And that's not a political fact, that's a biological fact that you can't legislate away. What you can do is like legislate control of it. And that's what a large section of this book deals with, which is like how are women's bodies controlled by these different systems, capitalism and socialism, and state socialism, and like all the other different things. And how does it affect women, and is there a better way forward? Now, both of you are, pardon me if I'm getting too personal, but I feel like both of you want families, and this is something that you both might have thought about, or it might be something
where I'm actually happy to jump in and be personal.
Sure.
I don't want kids.
All right.
I'm 26. A lot of people would probably say, like, you'll change your mind. I've been pretty sure from a very young age that I didn't want children. I don't have anything against other people's children. Acknowledge the societal need for them. I'm not a maternal person. And for many reasons, I don't think I would excel as a parent. Kind of too bad. My partner probably would be a really good dad. But he's also not super keen on them. I mean, you never know what'll happen. But in all likelihood, that's probably not something that's in the cards for me. And for a very long time, I found it very difficult to figure out why exactly that was. Now, it's partly that I think I'm a bit of a selfish person, and I like my life. I like my life as an adult without kids. It's pretty great. I won't lie. But it's also partly that I feel like I'm between a bit of a rock and a hard place, in that my partner would be miserable as a stay-at-home dad. It just wouldn't work for who he is as like a person and what he needs to do mentally and like all that sort of stuff. I'd be miserable as a stay-at-home mom. Like, I hate babysitting. And I know people say it's different when it's your own kids and stuff. I wouldn't enjoy being home with kids all day.
Mm-hmm.
But the childcare options available to us are either not very high quality or terrifyingly expensive on 2 professional salaries. So it's the sort of thing where, looking at this, I can almost see how, yeah, someone like me might make a different decision. And I might go, actually, yeah, I'll have a kid. Like, I don't hate them. Don't love the idea of pregnancy, but like, sure. I actually was born in Sweden and lived there for part of my childhood. And so seeing the experience my mom had putting my siblings in childcare in Sweden versus what that would be in North America makes me go like, yeah, if I had that system, sure, I'd happily send my kid to daycare every day and feel like I'm good with this. But in this system, it's like, I don't want to give up my job. My partner doesn't want to give up his job. And I guess you could say we're choosing not to afford high quality childcare. So, I mean, I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah,
No,
these things
it makes
really
sense.
play a big role in people's decisions.
Yeah.
No, that actually was what I was hoping that we would talk about, because, like I said, like we talk about like the United States being like the best, etc. And then you talk about like childcare and anything to do with health, really, and you're just like, what is this?
Yeah. So I would potentially like to have a
Mhm.
child, one.
Mhm.
And the reason that we haven't is because we don't know what the heck we're going to do about childcare. We don't live near either of our families. Right now, I'm in school, which gives me some amount of flexibility, but there's also a certain aspect of being in school that's almost more difficult to raise a child in,
Yeah.
because you take school home with you, or as right now, I'm just always at home with it. So we're not really sure when we want to do it. We're in a very good position because my husband's in the military. I am a veteran. We have very good health care, especially for America. But we don't like when is an optimal time, because even with that, what are we gonna do? Like, I'm lucky because I am on disability, so I would have the option to stay home and still pull some kind of a paycheck, but I don't know if I could do that, because I see my sister is a stay-at-home mom and she's brilliant at it, but she has really bad anxiety. Like, she feels crushed by her life to the point where she's not even sure she likes her kids. Like, and that sounds horrifying, but that's just the honest to God truth of it. And then a good friend of mine is the same way. She's been trying to work because her husband doesn't have a very good job, but they can't find consistent childcare, and she either loses her job or she has to quit. And like, that was that letter that do you remember the woman who had grown up or raised children in socialism? And it was a letter criticizing socialism. And she had a state-funded daycare slot for her kid 15 minutes from her house. Her husband got off work at 2 p.m., could go pick up the kid and cook dinner. And she was like mad because of the harried pace of her life. And I was like, I know women in America who would kill for that. If I had that kind of system, I'd have a baby today.
Yeah,
I would, because I want to have a child. I just don't know how to do it without completely ruining my life. And then, Republicans can't figure out why the birth rates are dropping. Well, maybe this is why. And like, I don't know, nobody seems to realize that having a baby is hard. I just saw a tweet this morning where they were like, maternity leave isn't paid time off. Imagine getting hit by a truck, pumped full of hormones, not able to sleep for months, and then tell me that's a vacation. Like,
I saw a really interesting talk earlier this winter, which might actually be interesting to you, Katie, as well, that did a study using the Marine Corps in the US, looking at the impact of childbirth and childbearing on women's health after you know, because we think about, yes, growing the baby is hard. Absolutely. That sounds awful and frankly a bit scary. Giving birth, that's hard.
Yeah.
But we sort of tend to think, I think, as a culture that, okay, well, baby's out of you, it's all back to normal.
Oh,
And for a variety of sample reasons that were incredibly interesting, the Marines made a really good case because of contract reasons and stuff, and they all have to do these fitness tests.
Yeah.
So they could actually look at women like in the period after they've had a baby and find that, like, yeah, their fitness suffers.
Yeah.
It takes a really long time to get back to full state pre-pregnancy.
Yeah.
And
I think that study
you're having
might
to
be
cope with
why-
that as you're taking on a big challenge of a newborn. Like,
yeah. They raised at least, I don't know if they extended the maternity leave, but I know paternity leave. They're called daddy days. They made that time period longer. So like men in the military, when their wife has a baby, it's like free time off, basically. They don't have to use their accrued days. And they can take a few, I think it's like a month now. And I think that type of a study might have impacted why they've been changing these rules and stuff. But then also it brings up, okay, if that's something that they've deemed necessary for the military, why is this not being rolled out on a large scale for the private sector?
exactly. And it would be really interesting to see what impact that would have on birth rate in general. Because I think there was a study from, I want to say Spain a couple of years ago, when they rolled something like that out. Basically, more paternity leave, more men paid type thing. And the men who took it were less likely to want more kids.
So this actually brings me to this idea that Ghodsee talks about in a book, which is like the idea of like what works in Scandinavian countries. And I've seen like a bunch of people in the comments talk about Scandinavian countries. And the way the Scandinavian countries did it was like, they provided like childcare, obviously, like creches and kindergartens and stuff. But they also introduced quotas for women, which is something that I've seen proposed in my country to incredible amounts of hostility, right? Like the moment somebody talks about quotas for women, we currently have quotas for like several oppressed minorities and stuff, like caste-based quotas, and that's under fire. And like several right-wing parties are trying to like mitigate that or erase that as much as possible. And then when they talk about women getting it too, people just start frothing at the mouth. But I wanted to ask you, like, especially Rosie, like, because you're an economist, what do you think about quotas? Like, what do you think about the quota system?
Honestly, this book actually made me think about it in a somewhat different way, because I've always been in favor of, you know, getting more women into government leadership positions, getting more minorities into these are things I'm very much in favor for. But I'd never really thought about the aspect that she brings up about how quotas normalize that, and how what I've always struggled with is, yes, we should absolutely hire, elect, all of these things based on merit. And of course, all of the people who traditionally get elected, hired, etc., think they're doing so purely on merit. And it's not they're necessarily bad candidates. It's that we've got an implicit bias towards what people in that role look like, what they are. That's what we expect. And I think she makes a pretty good argument in this as to how quotas applied thoughtfully can really help us, say, get past that bias a bit, get us exposed to this idea that, like, yeah, women are elected officials too. They should be. Why does it seem radical that we should be aiming for 50% representation? That's a reasonable thing. So, yeah, I thought that was a really interesting chapter, and she made for me at least, a very strong point on it.
What about you, Katie? Do you think quotas would fly in the United States?
With as much as like affirmative action is criticized, I don't know, because I was talking to my husband about it. My husband's Black, for people who don't know, and we were talking about affirmative action and how that is kind of a quota system, and how we're not even sure that that is working, because all it's doing is making people think that every Black person who gets hired or a spot in a university is only there because of the color of their skin.
Yeah.
But I mean, it does make sense in a normalization type of thing. But what she was saying too was that in some places you're voting for a party, whereas in America you're voting for candidates, and that does make a little bit of a difference, because like just optics wise. So I don't know, like I'm in favor of, like a more 50-50 split. I just feel like, oh man, it would be, I would be mad every time I got on to any social media. I would be angry, like, because of the things that people would be saying, because they automatically just discount, like they already do that, even though there's no quotas. Like, oh, it's just because of whatever. Like Kamala Harris, I've seen people, well, he only picked her because she was a woman of color, not because she had the credentials for the job. Well, she absolutely has the credentials for the job. Shut up. Like,
I don't know if the editions you guys read of this book had the same preface as the one I did, but I'm really glad I read it, because honestly, usually I would skip it, because there's a really interesting discussion about how people who want to maintain the status quo because it benefits them will use every argument to, like, no matter how you're arguing for it, to invalidate what you're trying to say and what you're trying to raise. And I think that's a really good point, Katie, that, like, yeah, how could you possibly introduce that in North America and not have people, how could you introduce that in a way that
I think it would have had to happen before the internet, when it was a little bit harder to get information. People didn't quite know that that's what was going on, and it became a normalized thing. And then they didn't need quotas. Like, I think that's what would have happened. In the age of the internet, everything is harder because everything is like transparent to a new degree, and everybody has an opinion and isn't afraid to share it, even if it's uneducated, uninformed, and stupid.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel like, so I agree with Katie, like what she said about like how people are already saying all this nonsense. And I've seen it. I mean, you think American Twitter is rough. You should see what Indian Twitter is like. Indian Twitter is like vile. So I've seen this as long as I've been on the internet, and even like offline. People have like no shame talking about people getting a leg up as if they're personally being robbed by these people. It's like, it's like they themselves are being somehow victimized by another person succeeding. That's what it really comes down to, like how they're like this person who I don't think deserves, success in this particular field. How dare they get ahead? Why isn't somebody being like noticing how I'm special? It just comes down to that.
It's the sort of thing where, to an extent, they have a point. Yeah, you've got to try harder now.
Yeah.
If a bunch of educated women enter the workforce, the overall standard is going to have to go up because there's more choice. There's more people to choose from. You can't. Yeah, you're going to lose what you feel like was something that was your right to have, but actually it's just that it's a more competitive market.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the case in anything like this.
And I feel like that's why so before I read this book, I would have said that, like quotas for women, like it's a pretty bad idea just because of all the things that you guys just mentioned, like the backlash is going to be intense, like people are not going to take them seriously, etc. And we've already seen that with like other populations. But honestly, like I've come to a point by the end of this book, I was like so mad at everything. I mean, I'm angry anyway. Like I have a lot of pent up rage about like most things relating to women. But by the end of this book, I was just like, I don't care. Like, screw it. If you're angry, be angry. Whine about it and cry about it on Twitter all you want from morning till night. I don't care. I want quotas. I want women to have like better options and choices than I did in my generation. Like, I see, because that's another thing that, like I keep talking about this. Like, the more I see young women, and I don't even mean like your generation of women, I mean like, because I'm about like 10 years older than you guys, but not even your generation. I mean like younger women, like women who are like 18, 19 years old. And I see them on social media, because otherwise, where would I meet like an 18, 19-year-old woman? Like, where would I do that? I'm not a creep. But I see them on social media and they're talking about shit that I went through 20 years ago. And I'm like, we should have progressed at least 5% instead of having to fight these battles every single time. We're just like, we're like hamsters on a wheel. We're just like, we're just going round and round and round, and like nothing ever happens. And if we need to burn the world down, if that's what, we need to do in order to get to the table, because right now I'm talking about like seat at the table. We're not even allowed in the, like right now we're in the foyer. Like that's how far we've gotten. But to get to
open the door for the men, that's it.
Right, that's it. We get to be doormen or doorwomen. But yeah, like I'm all for quotas after reading this book. I'm like, yes, let us do that and piss everyone off.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're about 46 minutes in, and I wanted to keep this to an hour if that was possible. So I'm gonna ask you guys, like, is there like stuff that I wanted to mention, like Katya was talking about Japan, and she mentioned that families in Japan are paid up to roughly $2,500 for giving birth to a child. And in addition, some Japanese employers offer bonuses to their employees for having babies. And that's because the birth rate is so low. And Japanese women, ever since they've been allowed to like get out of the home, get an education and work, we're like, well, I don't want to deal with this shit. Like, do it yourself, It's pretty great. And also, Gregory says quotas don't usually fly. Chile is using one for their new feminista implemented constitution. You have to implement quotas with working class reforms, healthcare, education, labor rights, etc. And by they don't fly, I mean too many people complain about them. That's all right, Gregory. I didn't think you were a bigot. Yeah, I agree, actually. Like, yeah, you can't just have quotas and be like, well, we have a quota and now everything is fixed.
And you can't have a quota without trying to address the effect of society to date.
Yeah. I'll come back to Katya's comment in a little bit. I wanted to ask you guys, I feel like I've been doing all the talking. So are there like other points you guys wanted to hit on? Katie.
Oh yeah, sorry, Katie, go ahead.
Something that I actually found really interesting was she compared that women, like how men in some countries are like, it's compulsory to join the military, and how that's kind of equivalent to women's role in society of giving birth. Like, yeah. And I liked that kind of, because I was like, yeah, like
we all take a 2-year career hit.
Yeah. I found that really interesting, because especially in America, people are like, oh, you want free school? Join the military. It's like, okay, but women then also have to give birth.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I don't know if I really have time to join them. I mean, I figured it out, but also I'm not going to have my bachelor's degree till I'm like in my 30s. So I mean,
if you have the GI Bill, then you should also have a uterus bill, and women give birth. There you go. Sorry, Katie, we cut you off. You were saying something. Sorry, not Katie. Sorry, Rosie.
Okay.
No, I was the one cutting off. It was not you. I was the one being an interrupt. This is a super small point that comes up in the chapter where she's comparing sexual satisfaction in the Eastern Bloc versus Western Europe type stuff. And it was really just a passing comment in a line where she mentions that, one of the possible explanations for women's increased sexual satisfaction, in addition to the fact that greater financial independence meant that they were having sex for pleasure, not to secure their livelihood type thing, was that also there was just less to do. And the outside world wasn't necessarily something you wanted to be such an active participant in when it was, to be fair, an oppressive police state. And so people retreated more into their own private lives, and you don't have, 50 channels on TV and all of that sort of stuff. And that struck me as something that, I was like, oh, go into this more. Yes. Think about this more. Again, not saying I want to live in a repressive police state, because absolutely not. But there is something to the fact that, and this is maybe getting personal and TMI, there's so much going on in life. There are so many things to do, even when you don't have a lot of responsibilities.
Yeah.
I would consider myself, basically as low responsibility as it is possible for an adult to be without a trust fund. There's so many things demanding our attention and that are easy to get sucked into and to pull into and stay busy with, that, yeah, maybe we're just not necessarily taking as much time or building that connection as much. So I don't know if anyone's read anything about that or seen articles about that. That was a topic that I was again, this is one of the ones I read last night, but I need to think about that more. I need to think about, is that one of the ways that this is affecting me without me even realizing it?
I'd be kind of interested to see, with COVID, taking out a lot of the things that people would normally do, how people's sex lives have changed since that became a thing.
That would be really interesting.
So I don't want to have kids either. And I knew that very early on. And I've never changed my mind, not even a little bit. And I feel for me, it wasn't a new, this wasn't new thought to me, because one of the reasons why I knew that there are multiple reasons when you make a decision like that about yourself, But one of the strong reasons was that I wanted to see as much of the world as possible and participate in it as much as possible, because I come from a background where women are not encouraged to participate in the world. And that is seen as a form of rebellion. And I knew from a very young age that I wanted to participate in the world, that I wanted to be present. I don't have fantasies of I don't have fantasies of grandeur where I'm just I will leave a mark in the world and people will remember me 500 years from now. I don't really care about that kind of stuff because I'll be dead. I care about just being present in the world. And I knew very clearly, very early on, that I couldn't do that and also be a mother the way that I understood motherhood culturally. And I couldn't find a balance. Knowing myself, I couldn't find a balance. And so something needed to give, and I didn't want to give up participating in the world. And I don't know, people keep telling me that I'll regret it one day, but I have not yet. And even if I do regret it, years down the line, I feel it's much better for me to regret my own choices than for me to regret choices that, my culture made for me or other people made for me. So,
and this is maybe getting a bit personal, but I've had similar thoughts sometimes, but I'd rather regret my choice than have my regret of a choice impact a child, which is maybe a weird, harsh thing to say, but
no,
if I regret my choice, I'm bearing the consequence of my action. But if I'm a bad parent,
that thought
someone else bears that.
I I am so afraid of that, of making a decision to have a child, but then realizing that there are other things I prioritize more, or that I am not willing to give up some of the things that I would need to give up in order to raise the child the way that I'm terrified of that. So I get it.
I have to say though, like, you know, this has been so, I mean, I knew this was going to be an interesting discussion, obviously, with like both of you, but it's also really interesting to me to see the way that we talk about it, like each of us talks about it, and all the different facets, because the things that come up so often when we are talking about women and their, you know, like the issues that, you know, the things that we've identified in the book that affect us personally or have resonance in our own lives, is that we talk about like, oh, you know, like this is so horrible, or, you know, maybe we shouldn't talk about this, or this isn't something that is okay to say, but it needs to be said. And every time, and I've had that impulse too, like, you know, when I discuss these things, and I always think like, why? Like, you know, like one of the reasons that we don't get to talk about the importance of politics in women's lives, and how politics can literally change women's lives for the better, and especially like leftist policies, let's be clear, is because we have this culture of silence around our lives and our decisions, and how it affects us, and how we feel like we are letting down some kind of standard that we ought to be maintaining, you know, and that maybe our mothers were able to do it at great cost to themselves, but we've internalized that and we've idealized that. And some of us just have mothers who are very honest about the sacrifices that they've made. Like my mom is like very much like don't do it. Like go do whatever you want. Like, you know, like having kids, like it ruined my body, it ruined my life, but I love you. But if I had a choice, like no. But it's just interesting to me that we continue, like even when we have access to like so much more information and knowledge and experiences around the world, we're still struggling with the weight of, you know, like, are we letting some kind of ideal down whenever we are talking about this? Anyway, I do have like one last thing that I want to talk about, but we'll just talk about like, you know, ending thoughts. Katie, do you have like any last thoughts you'd like to share?
I think I covered most of what I'd been thinking about.
Okay. How about you, Rosie?
I think the one thing I would add is more about the book in general than the topic specifically, which was I felt like she did an incredibly good job of walking the line between I'm not advocating for a totalitarian police state.
Mm-hmm.
And we can look at how some of the policies implemented in those environments have a positive impact. I think, and I don't know why I was worried about this, because I'm a pretty leftist person to begin with, but I think I had a bit of a concern starting this book that there was going to be a bit of the, we can't acknowledge anything bad about these countries and these types of system. But I think she does a really good job of, balancing between, look, there were elements that were not good for women and for society in general. We shouldn't be trying to replicate that. But how can we take and how can we learn from the elements that were good and what positive impacts did exist? Which was a nuance that I don't know why I'm surprised to find, but I thought worked really well.
Yeah, I agree. I had some of the same concerns. I didn't want it to be like a rosy picture. Sorry, maybe that's a bad turn of anyway. You know, totalitarian states, but she walked that line really well and made it clear that this was more, what can we learn from this to take to our own lives. That's a good point.
So for me, like the one thing that I came back to, and Katya mentioned a little while ago about how women's labor is devalued and isn't seen as financially valuable, even though it's the underpinning, as this book says. It's basically, it's basically the labor valuable, even though it's the underpinning, as this book says. It's basically. It's based. Okay, I have no idea what just happened.
I don't either, but I think it stopped. So.
StreamYard is like really angry. It's like an hour. How dare you? I'm wrapping up. But I, so the thing about this book is that it is a very general overview about women under different forms of, economies, and like how they function in these different contexts. And she is very clear in her notes afterwards that she is giving an overview, and that it is built upon, she's basically giving a very simplified explanation of ideas and topics that she's researched for 20 years as a PhD student, as an academic, like all of that. And what that means is that it sort of skips over a lot of nuance. So for one thing, like one of the things that really stuck out to me is like when she's talking about how women are like after the wall fell, women were explicitly turned into commodities in like the Russian context or the German context, etc. When you're talking about a book that is set in the United States, we do need to acknowledge the fact that Black women have historically always been explicit commodities in the United States. And their bodies were very clearly commodified even before there was a United States. And it continued right up until 150 years ago. So, and then even after that, the exploitation didn't stop. So I feel like that is something that, and also like a lot of the stuff that she's talking about, like how women are treated, and how a lot of right-wing or conservative thinkers talk about how they don't want to provide childcare for women because they feel like that would just give women too much power over their bodies and like devalue society or whatever. I mean, we've already seen that with Black women. The entire thing about Black welfare queens was it was a whole thing, and it was explicitly about Black women. So I feel like there are, like, if somebody, or if she herself wanted to do like an intersectional reading and just sort of expand upon these ideas, I would read that. I think that would be
this book was great. I'd happily read the book that was twice as long and slightly more on the academic side. Like, this one has a very good intro to the topic.
Mm-hmm.
It was very enjoyable. Recommend to anyone. Mm-hmm. Personally, I'd be very interested in the, what's the more expanded, more in-depth, more considered version of this?
Yeah, I think I would like a second installation, I guess, that really focused on like intersectionality and how minority women are even more impacted. And I think I would want it co-written with Isabel Wilkerson because she's fabulous.
Yes.
And I think she would have a lot to add to that conversation.
Actually, I think, Katie, like you have Mickey Kendall's Hood Feminism on your TBR, or you did a while back, and I would recommend that to both of you, actually. And if you read it, then we can do another one of these lives, and we can talk about more of it.
Okay, so that sounds good, actually.
Yeah, I have been meaning to pick that one up. It sounds.
It's really actually good. Anyway. So just to wrap things up, so Rosie is at Rosie Cockshutt, and she has a very eclectic channel of her own. Rosie, what are you reading right now?
I'm reading, well, actually only 2 books at the moment, which, if you've been around my channel before, is rare. I'm reading, what am I reading? Wintertide by Andrew Caldecott, which is a fantasy novel set in a weird town in a fictional part of England that's got weird history and all sorts of conspiracy stuff going on. And I'm reading Whose Body by Dorothy Sayers, which is a 1920s murder mystery. And oh my goodness, I'm in love.
Yeah, Peter Wimsey is great. You think you're in love right now, but wait until like the love of his life shows up, and then like things will be like so much better. Yeah, it's gonna be great. But it takes a few books for her to show up, but you know, it's amazing when she does. Yeah, Joy just got Hood Feminism, and she should read it. Katie is her channel is called Katie Reads and Rants, and if you think Rosie and I read eclectic, you should check out Katie's channel, because I tell everyone, you know, like her book hauls are a thing of beauty. Like I've never seen anything like it. It's amazing.
I actually haven't done one in a while.
Yeah, I mean, you literally have to be like shut up in your house for you not to have done it. Like, it's amazing. So Katie, what have you been reading lately?
A lot of things. I started Plain Bad Heroines by Emily M. Danforth, I think is the author.
Mm-hmm.
And that's been good. I'm really confused, but I'm enjoying the writing, so it's fine. I'm reading, I think it's called The Big Picture by Brian Greene. I thought it was going to be more physics heavy, but it's actually more like philosophy heavy about kind of finding a theory of everything and how like various scientific fields intersect. And then last night I started Come Fly the World, the Jet Age story of the women of Pan Am.
Wow.
I can't wait to hear what you think of that one. That sounds so interesting.
You know, 2 chapters in, so we'll see.
What about you, Amrita? What are you reading?
I just began These Violent Delights, which is that Romeo and Juliet in 1920s Shanghai, and there's also like a murder, like a monster on the loose. And I'm like in the first chapter, like I'm through the prologue and I'm in the first chapter, and so far it's amazing, and it's definitely holding my interest. I just finished Winter's Orbit, which is a romance set in space, and I highly recommend it to everybody. It's very great. And I am also reading Accidentally Engaged by Farah Heron, and it's a rom-com, and I haven't started it yet, but I do have it loaded up on my Kindle ready to go. So yeah, that's what I'm reading currently.
Fun.
Right. So yeah, ladies, would we recommend this book to everybody? I would.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you both for reading this book with me. I couldn't choose 2 better people to read it with. And thank you for like spending all this time talking about it too. And thank you everybody who showed up. Thank you everybody for watching. And we might do something like this again. Like, let us know if that's something that would interest you. And we will see you soon, I guess, on one of our channels. I've got description and links to both Rosie and Katie in the description below. So be sure to check it out if you don't follow them already. That's it. That's me, Amrita, and this is Rosie and Katie, and we'll see you again real soon. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.